Trains aren't supposed to vanish into thin air, but the Cascade Bell did. Jack Callahan never believed in ghosts until the night he stepped onto a train that shouldn't exist. The passengers were laughing, the silverware clinking, the golden glow of the chandeliers spilling onto polished tables. It felt real. It felt alive. But the moment he checked his pocket and found a ticket with no date, he knew this train wasn't taking him home. It was taking him somewhere else. And once you board the Cascade Bell, you don't get off. Snow had been falling relentlessly, draping Denver in an eerie, unbroken hush, the kind that made the city feel forgotten by time. Jack Callahan sat motionless by the window of his cramped apartment above a dying hardware store, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the world disappear beneath winter's grip. The feeble glow from his desk lamp shuddered, throwing restless shadows over a heap of yellowed case files, ghosts of a life he had long since abandoned. He wasn't one to dwell on the past, but nights like this had a way of unearthing memories better left buried. Once he had been the agency's sharpest blade, the man who chased shadows through alleyways and dragged criminals from their hiding places. 5 years ago he had been a Pinkerton detective, relentless and feared, but a single mistake had shattered it all, a bullet that should have ended him but didn't, a case that cost him more than his reputation. He walked away from it, let the dust settle, and told himself he had no regrets. Now his biggest thrill was the occasional bar scuffle or missing pocket watch, and even that was growing dull. His coffee was cold, the silence pressing, when the sudden clatter of footsteps rushed up the stairwell, sharp and urgent. A knock followed, precise and deliberate, 3 quick raps against the wood. Jack didn't move at first, but the voice that followed forced his hand. "Callahan, you in there?" He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over the stubble on his chin before swinging the door open. Thomas Green stood there, looking like a man on the edge, wiry, pale, his thick-rimmed glasses askew as if he had run straight from the station. Green worked for the railroad, which meant one thing: trouble. "I'm off the clock, Tom," Jack muttered, leaning against the doorframe. "This isn't about a lost shipment," Green shot back, pushing his way inside. "It's the Silver Spectre." Jack frowned. The name was known to anyone who paid attention, a luxury express cutting through the Rockies like a ghost, ferrying the elite in gilded excess. But something in Green's voice made Jack straighten. "What about it?" "It vanished." Jack blinked, then narrowed his gaze. "Vanished. 3 nights ago. Supposed to pull into Denver at dawn. Never did." Green's fingers twitched as he spoke. No wreck, no signal. Not even a trace of it on the tracks, like it never existed. Trains didn't just disappear, not in this world. Jack crossed his arms, skepticism warring with something darker, something he had long tried to ignore. "You sent search teams?" "Of course," Green snapped. "For days now. Not a damn thing, not even a broken rail. That should have been the end of it." Jack had no stake in this. But then Green reached into his coat, pulled out a folded sheet of paper, and hesitated before speaking. "A man turned up in Durban this morning, Henry Slater. He says he was on the Spectre when it vanished." Jack's pulse slowed. He had heard that name before. Slater had been tied up in land deals, something about a disputed mining claim, but that wasn't what made Jack pause. It was the way Green's voice faltered, the way his fingers clenched around the paper as if afraid of what it held. "Where is he now?" "Durban Clinic. Doc says he's in bad shape. Frostbite, half delirious. Keeps muttering about what he saw in the mountains." Jack didn't ask what that was. He could see it in Green's face. Whatever Slater had whispered, it had rattled the man. Outside, the storm howled against the buildings, rattling the glass in its frame. He should have said no. He had every reason to. But something in his gut, something primal, something that had once made him the best, told him to listen. "Fine," Jack muttered, grabbing his coat and hat. "I'll take a look, but no promises." By the time Jack boarded the search train bound for Durban, night had swallowed the Rockies. The carriage was nearly empty, save for two weary railroad men hunched in a corner, their murmurs lost beneath the steady drone of steel slicing through ice. Jack took a window seat, watching the world blur past in streaks of white and black, a landscape devoured by the storm. Higher they climbed, deeper into the frozen wild, where the wind howled through the ridges like a living thing. The snow thickened, swirling in spectral shapes outside the window. Jack leaned forward, rubbing the frost from the glass, and his breath hitched. Far beyond the trees, along the ridgeline where no light should be, something flickered, distant, faint, moving. His fingers twitched toward the revolver at his hip. Just the wind, he told himself. Just tricks of the storm. But deep in his bones, Jack Callahan knew better. They weren't alone in the mountains, not anymore. Durban was less of a town, and more of a last outpost, a handful of wooden buildings huddled together against the ruthless cold, as if bracing for the moment the snow would finally erase them. Jack Callahan stepped off the train onto the frost-bitten platform, his boots crunching against ice, breath curling in the air like ghostly tendrils. The wind howled through the empty streets, rattling the wooden signs above shuttered shops, a town caught in the grip of something deeper than winter. He pulled his coat tighter and walked toward the only building showing signs of life, the clinic, its chimney bleeding thin trails of smoke into the starless sky. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of antiseptic, and something more metallic, something that made Jack's instincts prickle. "Help you?" a nurse asked, peering over her round glasses. "Henry Slater," Jack muttered, shaking the snow from his hat. "Upstairs. Second door on the left." The stairs groaned beneath his weight as he climbed, each creak swallowed by the hush of the building. He knocked once, then pushed the door open. Henry Slater sat by the window, swathed in a heavy blanket, staring at the snow-laden trees, with the hollow gaze of a man who had seen something he wasn't meant to. His skin was pale, almost waxen, his fingers twitching against the wool as if warding off a phantom touch. He didn't turn when Jack spoke. "Mr. Slater," the man barely blinked. "They said someone would come." His voice was barely above a whisper, brittle and thin. "I'm Jack Callahan. I want to know what happened on the Silver Spectre." At the mention of the train, Slater flinched, his knuckles going white against the fabric. When he finally looked at Jack, the fear in his eyes was raw, unfiltered, not the kind of fear born from imagination, but the kind that clings to a man who has seen the impossible. "You won't believe me," he rasped. "Try me." Jack settled into the chair across from him, pulling out a small notebook. Slater hesitated, then spoke, voice unsteady. "It started the second night," he whispered. "I was in my compartment reading. Everything was normal. The train was gliding through the mountains, smooth as ever, and then I heard them." "Them?" Jack asked, his pen tapping against the page. "Footsteps, but not inside." Slater swallowed hard. Jack frowned. "An animal? Too heavy." Slater's eyes flickered toward the window again, like he expected to see something staring back. "I thought maybe a worker was up there, checking something. But when I looked out, I saw nothing. Just trees and snow rushing past." He exhaled shakily, and then people started disappearing. Jack stilled. "No screams, no signs of struggle," Slater continued, voice barely audible. "The woman in the compartment next to mine. Gone. Her luggage was still there, the door locked from the inside, like she'd just ceased to exist." Jack's fingers tightened around his pen. "How many vanished?" "By the third night, half the train," Slater croaked. A cold weight settled in Jack's chest. "And no one stopped the train." Slater let out a dry, humorless laugh. "We tried, but the conductor, he was gone too." Jack stiffened. "Gone. There was no one driving the train," Slater whispered. Jack studied him, searching for cracks in his story, but there was no deception, only terror. Either Slater was losing his mind, or something unspeakable had happened in those mountains. Slowly, Jack reached into his coat, pulling out a folded paper. "The railroad gave me the passenger list," he said, sliding it across the table. "Take a look. See if anything stands out." Slater hesitated before taking it. His eyes flicked down the names, scanning, searching until his breath hitched. His hands trembled, tightening around the paper, his face draining of what little color remained. These names, his voice was barely above a whisper. Jack leaned forward. "What about them?" But Slater didn't answer. He just kept staring, his fingers tightening, until the paper began to tear. Jack Callahan studied the names on the list, his pulse thrumming in his ears. "What about them?" he asked quietly. Slater's face had gone bloodless, his fingers twitching over the crumpled page. "Some of these people, they weren't on the train," he whispered. "I would have noticed them." His hand jabbed at a particular name. "Daniel Greaves. I know for a fact this man wasn't there. I spoke with nearly every passenger in the lounge car. He wasn't one of them." Jack's frown deepened as he scanned the list, noticing something strange. Certain names bore faint, almost imperceptible marks, as if the ink had been smeared by an unseen hand. "You're sure?" Jack pressed. "Absolutely." Slater's voice had a hard edge of certainty. Then his expression shifted, something like dawning horror creeping into his eyes. "And look at this one, Caroline Price. I remember her now, but she wasn't on the train at first. One night, she was just there, sitting in the dining car like she'd been there all along." Jack's grip on the paper tightened. He didn't believe in coincidences, and this was starting to feel like something worse, something deliberate. He exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Have you ever heard of the ghost line?" The reaction was instant. Slater's breath hitched, his throat working as he swallowed hard. "The miners talked about it," he murmured. "Old tracks near Black Summit. A train disappeared there, long ago, and they say when the snow falls heavy, it still runs." The room felt colder, the shadows stretching unnaturally as Jack tucked the passenger list back into his coat. Slater's hand shot out suddenly, gripping Jack's wrist with surprising strength. "It's not just a story," he whispered urgently. "I saw lights in the trees, Callahan, lanterns, swinging, but no one holding them." Jack pried himself free, stepping back. "Get some rest, Slater," he said. But as he reached the door, Slater's voice halted him again. "Wait," he rasped. Fumbling beneath his blanket, from its folds, he produced a small gleaming object, and pressed it into Jack's hand. "I found this in my pocket the night I got here. I don't know how it got there." Jack turned the item over in his palm, a gold ticket stub, pristine despite the storm that should have ruined it. The ink shimmered faintly in the dim light, untouched by time. His breath hitched, as he read the date stamped on its surface. It wasn't from the past. It was 3 days in the future. Jack said nothing. He only slipped the ticket into his coat, and stepped out into the frozen night, the wind whispering through the trees like distant, unseen voices. Benson hesitated, his eyes darting to the station's darkened windows as if expecting something to be watching from the cold. His voice dropped to a whisper. "I saw something the night it disappeared," he admitted. "I was locking up when I spotted lights along the tracks, lanterns swaying, moving like someone was walking the line." His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. "But there shouldn't have been anyone out there." Jack narrowed his eyes. "Could have been workers," he suggested. Benson shook his head. "No train was scheduled that late. And besides, the lights, they weren't just moving, they were floating." A chill that had nothing to do with the cold crept over Jack's spine, but he kept his face impassive. He'd heard ghost stories before. Miners, rail workers, drifters all had their tales, but this one felt different. He left the station without another word, pulling his coat tight as he followed the tracks into the mountains. The snow muffled everything, swallowing footprints almost as soon as they were made. Hours passed, the cold pressing against him like an unseen weight, until finally, something emerged from the whiteout, a tunnel wide and yawning, its mouth fringed with icicles like the teeth of some great beast. Jack frowned. He hadn't seen any mention of a tunnel on the maps. He yanked them from his coat, scanning the old railway plans Green had given him in Denver. The Cascade Bell's route ended 2 miles back. This tunnel shouldn't exist. Snow clung to a battered sign half buried near the entrance. Jack wiped it clean, his fingers stiff with cold. The faded letters sent a shiver through him. Black Summit Pass. His breath plumed in the frigid air. Slater had mentioned Black Summit, the ghost line, a superstitious miner's tale, and yet, here it was. Jack exhaled sharply, and stepped forward. The tunnel swallowed him whole. The moment he crossed the threshold, sound seemed to drop away. The air was heavy, the silence unnatural. Then whispers. At first he thought it was the wind, but as he moved deeper, the voices sharpened, curling in the darkness like unseen fingers. He stopped. The word had been clear, deliberate. He turned sharply, heart hammering, but there was nothing, just shadows, just silence. His pulse pounded in his ears as he forced himself forward, step by step, until at last, light shimmered at the far end. He emerged into the snow, exhaling in relief, until his boot hit something solid. Jack crouched, brushing frost from the object. His stomach dropped. A rail car, half buried in the snow, its windows dark and frosted over. But not just any car. He recognized the faded gold lettering immediately. Cascade Bell, dining car. Jack's breath hitched. This shouldn't be. His legs moved before his mind could catch up, climbing the frozen steps. The metal rail was bitterly cold under his grip. The door creaked open beneath his hand, revealing a tableau frozen in time. Inside the air was stale, unmoving. Tables were still set, silverware, crystal glasses, everything perfectly arranged as if dinner had only just been served. Plates of food, untouched, lay covered in ice. Steaks turned to stone. Half-empty glasses stood next to chairs, pulled back, abandoned mid-meal. But there were no people, no sign of panic, no struggle, just absence. Jack's boots scuffed against the floor as he moved cautiously through the car, his breath the only sound. A creeping sensation curled in his gut. They had been here, and then they weren't. At the far end of the car something caught his eye, a coat draped over a chair. His fingers brushed the fabric. It was warm. Jack's eyes narrowed. The snow outside hadn't touched the car, yet the coat, still warm, hadn't been here long. The Cascade Bell had not been abandoned for long. That much was certain, and whoever, or whatever, had left it behind might still be close. The thought sent a cold shiver crawling up Jack's spine, but he pushed it aside. The locomotive. That was where the truth lay. He needed answers, even if some part of him wasn't sure he wanted them. For half an hour, Jack pressed on through the snow, the silence around him unnatural, heavy. Then through the white haze he saw it, the massive black locomotive, resting eerily at the bottom of a ravine, tilted slightly to one side, as if it had been set down with care rather than derailed. No steam, no smoke, no shattered glass or twisted metal. It was pristine, untouched, as though frozen in time. Jack's frown deepened. Trains didn't just vanish and reappear undamaged. This was wrong. Climbing down the ravine, he hauled himself onto the platform, gripping the cold metal of the engine's side. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was eerily still. No conductor, no engineer. The controls were intact, levers and switches frozen in place. It was as if the train had been abandoned mid-journey, time locking it in place. Jack's fingers brushed over the frost-coated dials before his eyes landed on a small compartment in the back. The door was locked, He gave it a hard tug. Nothing. A second. A third. The latch snapped. Inside, a single leather satchel sat in the dark, its surface coated in dust. Jack pulled it out and flipped it open. A folded telegram lay within, its edges yellowed but the ink unnervingly fresh. Jack's gut tightened as he unfolded it, scanning the words. Midnight. We are no longer alone. Something is aboard. It is not human. Do not stop. Do not. The message ended abruptly. Jack's grip tightened around the paper, his pulse pounded in his ears. Not human. He wasn't the type to entertain ghost stories. He'd spent years chasing criminals who thrived on fear and superstition, using whispers in the dark to stay hidden. But this was different. He could feel it, like an unseen weight pressing against his chest. He stepped back outside, the wind whipping around him. His gaze followed the tracks. They didn't end at the ravine. A faint path stretched ahead, barely visible beneath the fresh snow, leading deeper into the mountains. Jack followed it, his steps light, his hand drifting instinctively toward the revolver at his hip. The storm howled around him, but beneath it, something else lingered. A whisper, a presence. Then he saw it, an old wooden sign, half buried in ice. Kneeling, Jack wiped away the snow, revealing the carved letters beneath. Black Summit Pass. Closed 1894. His heart skipped a beat. Slater had mentioned Black Summit, the ghost line, a stretch of track lost to time, whispered about by miners and railway men alike. Jack had dismissed it as legend, but now, standing here, staring at the name carved in the wood, he wasn't so sure. His gloved fingers traced the worn lettering. In 1894, a train had derailed here, the Morning Star, and no one had ever found it. Jack Callahan listened to Benson's words carefully before asking, "What did you see?" Benson's face paled. "Last night, while locking up the station, I saw a light moving along the tracks, like someone swinging a lantern." Jack's mind processed this quickly. "Could have been a worker," he suggested, but Benson shook his head. No trains were scheduled, and the strangest thing, his voice faltered, the light wasn't touching the ground, it was floating. Jack didn't respond, just pulled his coat tighter and stepped outside, following the snow-covered tracks into the frozen unknown. The wind howled, carving strange patterns into the ice, as if trying to whisper a warning. Hours passed, and just as his footprints began vanishing under fresh snowfall, something caught his eye, a tunnel, hidden beneath layers of ice and time. The entrance was draped in thick icicles, like frozen teeth, waiting to swallow him whole. Jack reached for his old railway map, tracing his finger along the familiar lines. According to the map, this tunnel didn't exist, yet a barely visible sign was buried beneath the frost. Jack brushed away the snow, his breath fogging the letters as they revealed themselves. Black Summit Pass. His heartbeat quickened. That name, Henry Slater, had whispered it. A forgotten journey, a ghost line that shouldn't exist. Jack swallowed his hesitation and stepped inside. The darkness folded around him like a thick fog, swallowing every sound except one, a voice. "Jack." He spun around. Nothing, just the tunnel's endless black void. The air felt wrong, static with something unfinished. He shook off the unease and kept moving. Then his boot struck something. Kneeling down, he brushed away the frost. A train car, buried beneath years of ice and snow. The Cascade Bells dining car. Jack peered through the frozen glass. The tables were set, plates untouched, silverware glinting in the dim light, but the seats were slightly pulled back, as if people had stood up suddenly. The most unsettling thing, a coat draped over one of the chairs. When Jack reached out, his fingers recoiled. The fabric wasn't cold. He exhaled sharply. The train wasn't the only thing that had been left behind. He needed to find the rest of it. Following the barely visible tracks deeper into the pass, he reached a small ravine where something loomed beneath the snow. The locomotive. It was intact. Too intact. No shattered glass. No twisted metal. Just an untouched engine. sitting as if carefully placed there. Jack climbed onto the frozen platform and forced the door open. Inside, the cabin was dark, eerily silent. The control panel remained frozen in time, switches unmoved. The conductor's chair was empty. No bodies, no blood, nothing. Jack's flashlight flickered as he scanned the cabin, its beam catching on a small locked compartment near the coal bin. The brass handle was iced over. He jammed his knife into the gap and wrenched it open. Inside, a small leather satchel rested against the wall. Jack unfastened the straps, reaching inside until his fingers brushed against something hard. Paper. A telegram. The words were hurried, desperate. Midnight. We are not alone. Something boarded. It is not human. Do not stop. Do not. The message ended abruptly. Jack turned the paper over. It had never been sent. His pulse pounded in his ears. This wasn't just a legend. This wasn't just an old ghost story. This was real. Then, out of the corner of his eye, something else caught his attention, a black leather binder, barely visible beneath the snow. Jack pulled it free, shaking off the frost. Passenger manifest. Flipping through the pages, he read name after name, each neatly typed, every compartment accounted for. His finger stopped midway down the list. His stomach twisted. Jack Callahan, compartment 3C. His breath came in sharp gasps. This wasn't possible. He had never boarded the Cascade Belle. He had never bought a ticket. But here it was, printed in ink, undeniable. His mind reeled. Was this his past? Or was someone writing his future? And if the train was just a ghost story, then what the hell was it doing here? The wind howled louder, the snowfall thickening. Somewhere in the distance, a sound rose above the storm, a whistle, not from the wreckage, not from the past. It was coming from ahead. Jack Callahan was no longer just solving a mystery. He was part of it. Jack Callahan sat in silence, the weight of the telegram pressing against his palm as Benson exhaled a slow breath. The station master's cigar still unlit between his fingers. The Black Summit disaster, Jack murmured, keeping his voice steady. Benson's gaze flickered toward the howling snowstorm outside. You've heard of it? Jack pressed. Benson nodded, his expression grim. Everyone around here has. He leaned forward, voice dropping lower. A freight train vanished in a blizzard. When they found it, well, he hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. Let's just say the cargo wasn't what they were expecting. Jack's eyes narrowed. Cargo. Benson didn't answer at first, his gaze lingering on the frost-covered window. Then, barely above a whisper, passengers. Jack straightened. There weren't supposed to be any passengers. Benson nodded. Exactly. The train's manifest was empty. No records, no tickets, no reason for anyone to be there. But when they found the wreck, his voice faltered. Every seat was full. Dozens of them, frozen solid. Jack felt his pulse quicken. They weren't on the manifest. Benson shook his head, his jaw tightening. And no one knew who they were. Some thought they were ghosts. Others, his voice dropped, thought they were something else. Souls lost in transit, caught between places. Jack exhaled, forcing himself to stay composed. He reached into his coat, pulling out the damp, time-worn passenger manifest he'd taken from the wreck. The names were faded, barely legible beneath years of ice and decay. His eyes scanned down the page, past strangers and forgotten identities, until they stopped, cold and unmoving, on one name. Jack Callahan. His breath stilled. He swallowed hard. That's impossible. A bitter chill crept into his bones, something deeper than the cold outside. He had never boarded the Cascade Belle. He had never bought a ticket, but his name was there, neatly printed, just as it had been on the list from the first wreck. Jack folded the paper with slow, deliberate movements, sliding it into his pocket as he rose. "Thanks, Benson," he said, his voice steady, despite the storm raging inside him. "I'll be back in the morning." But as Jack stepped into the night, snow crunching underfoot. A suffocating feeling settled over him, a realization, one that made his skin crawl. He might not have until morning. Hours later, Jack stumbled into an abandoned outpost along the tracks, its wooden walls groaning against the wind. He shoved the door open, stepping inside as dust and snow swirled in his wake. The place was dark, long deserted. A cracked lantern sat on the counter, its glass covered in a thick layer of frost. Torn posters lined the walls, their faded ink whispering of events long forgotten. Jack dropped his bag near the door, kneeling beside the stone fireplace. He struck a match, the flame flickering before catching the brittle wood. As the fire grew, warmth crawled up his arms, heavy exhaustion settling into his muscles. Just for a moment, he thought. Just a moment of rest. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, uneven, moving just beyond the edge of the fire's glow. Jack's breath hitched. His hand shot to his revolver, fingers wrapping tightly around the grip. The floorboards groaned, the shadows shifting, stretching, taking shape. Figures emerged from the dimness, men and women dressed in clothes from another time, suits and dresses caked in frost, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes sunken, but they weren't hostile, no, they looked afraid. One man stepped forward, his hands trembling. Jack knew him instantly. Henry Slater. Jack's lips parted, the name barely above a whisper. Slater. The man nodded, his expression haunted. Past the veil, he murmured. Jack frowned. What veil? Slater didn't answer. His gaze drifted toward the snow-covered tracks outside, his voice heavy with something close to despair. The bell isn't gone, it's caught. Somewhere in between. He turned back to Jack, eyes filled with something Jack couldn't place, recognition, fear, understanding. Jack took a step back, his grip tightening on his gun. That's not possible. I walked here, I boarded the search train. Slater shook his head, and Jack felt his stomach drop. No, Jack, you never left. The fire crackled, but Jack no longer felt the warmth. The wind howled, rattling the window panes, and somewhere deep in the storm, a whistle shrieked through the night. Not from the wreck, not from a memory, it was coming from ahead. The train was still running, and it was coming for him. Jack's heartbeat pounded against his ribs as he stared at the ticket stub in his hand. The date it had changed. It wasn't from the past anymore, it was today. His breath hitched, the weight of it sinking into his chest like ice. Around him, the spectral passengers stood in silent anticipation, their hollow eyes fixed on him. Slater stepped forward, his presence flickering like a candle in the wind. "There's a way," he murmured, his voice barely more than a breath, "a way to bring it back." Jack straightened, shaking snow from his coat. "The train." Slater gave a slow, hesitant nod. "It's not gone, it's stuck. Between here and—" He trailed off, eyes shifting toward the window where the blizzard raged. "But the tracks, Jack, they're not gone either, just hidden." Jack narrowed his eyes. Hidden how? Slater pointed to the far end of the station, his trembling fingers barely steady, beneath the floor. "The old conductor once mentioned a switch, said it could reset the line." Jack didn't hesitate. He crossed the room in hurried strides, kicking aside broken crates and rusted tools. Slater moved to help, his pale hands brushing against the frozen wood, leaving behind a trail of frost. Jack's boot struck something solid, a metal hatch, its edges buried beneath years of dust and neglect. He knelt, wiping away the debris, revealing a brass handle dulled with time. Taking a deep breath, he yanked it open with a groan of rusted hinges. Inside, a thick iron lever sat waiting, untouched for what felt like centuries. It was heavy, solid, its surface caked in ice and decay. Jack wrapped his fingers around it. "What happens when I pull this?" he asked. Slater hesitated, his eyes dark with something close to fear. Jack swallowed hard. And who's on it? Slater's gaze flickered toward the storm outside. The ones who took us. The words sent a chill deeper than the winter air. Jack clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the lever. Whatever haunted these mountains, whatever force had trapped the Cascade Bell in its limbo, he wasn't going to let it win. He pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. The station remained silent, the only sound the wind howling through broken beams. Jack wiped sweat from his forehead, ignoring the cold seeping into his bones. Then the storm outside changed. The wind slowed, turning to an eerie whisper, a hum that crawled beneath his skin. A shadow flickered in the snow. Then another. Figures. Jack's breath hitched. Dark silhouettes emerged from the blizzard, moving in unnatural silence. At first, they were just shifting shapes, but as they neared, their faces became clear, pale, hollow-eyed remnants of what were once human. Jack reached instinctively for his revolver, but deep down he knew it wouldn't matter. The figures glided forward, their feet never touching the ground. He recognized some of them, the passengers from the dining car, the ones who had vanished, but something was wrong. Their eyes, they weren't human anymore. A tall man in a torn suit stepped ahead, his lips cracked, his voice a whisper of wind and death. "You can't stop it," he murmured. "It's already begun." Jack took a step back. The man's fingers twitched, stretching unnaturally long as he reached forward. Jack stumbled, his heel catching the edge of the open hatch. He felt the weight of unseen hands wrapping around his arms, pulling, dragging him toward the darkness. Cold rushed over him, and for a moment, the fire's warmth vanished entirely. Then, a sound, a low distant rumble. Jack's head snapped toward the window. Through the swirling snow it appeared. The Cascade Bell. The train slid into view, its headlights cutting through the storm like twin eyes in the abyss. The sound of grinding steel filled the air as it barreled forward, a ghostly behemoth roaring back to life. The figures turned, their hollow faces lifting toward the oncoming train. A flicker of recognition, of fear, flashed in their vacant expressions. Jack didn't wait. He wrenched the lever again. Sparks flared from the base, the ground beneath him trembling. The air thickened, warping, twisting, and then the train screamed. A shriek of metal, of something far beyond the world Jack knew. And in that moment he realized, he wasn't just bringing it back. He was already on it. Jack's breath came in short, sharp bursts as the engine screeched, its glowing eyes piercing the darkness. Steam billowed in great clouds, swallowing the figures in a haze of gold and gray as the train groaned to a halt. The platform trembled beneath his feet. The doors hissed open, spilling warm golden light onto the icy floor. The figures, those eerie hollow-eyed remnants of lost souls, froze in place, their elongated shadows wavering against the station walls. Jack scrambled to his feet, heart pounding. A whisper brushed against his ear. "You did it," Slater murmured beside him, his breath warm against the cold. But before Jack could respond, the world tilted. The air shimmered, snow dissolving like melting ink, walls fading, shifting, transforming, velvet, polished brass, candlelight. Jack blinked. He was standing inside the Cascade Bell's dining car once more. Around him, the hum of laughter and music filled the air, passengers clinking glasses, exchanging pleasantries as though nothing had happened. A waiter passed by, tipping his hat. "Good evening, Mr. Callahan." Jack turned sharply, his reflection catching in the window. The endless storm outside was gone. The train moved smoothly along the tracks, not a tremor beneath his feet. It was as if the nightmare had never occurred. But as he exhaled, his fingers brushed something cold in his pocket. The gold ticket stub. Jack pulled it out slowly, his stomach twisting. The date was gone. It bore no time, no past, no future. Just an empty marker of something unfinished. A soft chime rang through the car. The murmuring voices hushed. Fawkes pausing mid-air, tall, with a uniform pressed to eerie perfection, his gloved hands folded neatly in front of him. Jack rose from his seat as the man approached, every step impossibly smooth. "I don't believe we've met," Jack said, voice calm but firm. The conductor's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "You could say that, but I've been here the whole time, Mr. Callahan." Jack's blood ran cold. "I know what's happening," Jack murmured, narrowing his eyes. "This train, these people, they're trapped." The conductor tilted his head, an amused glint in his gaze. "They aren't trapped, Mr. Callahan. They are safe. They exist here exactly as they were meant to." Jack clenched his fist around the ticket. "No, this isn't safety, it's a prison, and you're keeping them here." The conductor's smile thinned, the candlelight flickered, and suddenly the shadows beneath his feet stretched. The darkness bled outward, pooling like ink, swallowing the spaces between them. "I am this train," the conductor whispered, his voice now a hollow echo. "I keep them here. I protect them from what lies beyond the veil." Jack's grip tightened around the ticket. "You're lying," he said, through gritted teeth. "This isn't protection, it's a cage." The conductor's eyes darkened, the gold embroidery on his uniform seeming to flicker, almost alive. His voice sharpened, cold as steel. "If you pull that lever again, Mr. Callahan, you will doom them. The storm outside, the cold, it will swallow them whole. They won't survive." Jack's gaze flickered around the car. The passengers, smiling, laughing, drinking their wine, were blissfully unaware, frozen in time, trapped in a loop. He could see it now, their movements identical, the same gestures, the same laughter, repeating, over and over, like a song stuck on the same haunting note. The realization settled like ice in his chest. "I can save them," Jack said, his voice unwavering. The conductor took a step closer. "You can save yourself." His voice was lower now, almost coaxing. "Step off at the next stop, Mr. Callahan. Forget about this, no one will know, no one will even remember." Jack felt the weight of the gold ticket in his palm. This was the choice: walk away, let it go, live, or risk everything. His pulse thundered, his breath slowed, the candlelight flickered again, and Jack made his decision. "No deal," Jack said, his voice firm as steel. The conductor's eyes darkened, shifting from a deep, knowing gaze to endless pools of pitch-black void. The air in the locomotive shuddered, vibrating with something ancient, something alive. Jack felt it in his bones. The train wasn't just haunted, it was hungry. If he could pull it here, in this moment, maybe, just maybe, he could bring it back for good. Jack didn't hesitate. He bolted for the locomotive, boots pounding against the metal floor, his breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. Snow swirled inside the cabin, carried by an unnatural wind, moving like spectral hands grasping at his coat. The storm outside was no longer just weather, it was an entity, twisting and writhing, howling in protest. And then he saw it. The brass handle, the lever, it gleamed beneath the frost, half buried beneath layers of ice, as if the train itself was trying to keep it hidden. Jack lunged for it. "Don't." The voice was behind him. He spun around, heart hammering. The conductor stood in the doorway, his shadow flickering like fire, stretching unnaturally against the walls. The air around him pulsed, distorting as if the train itself was breathing. "They belong here," the conductor said quietly. "So do you." Jack's grip tightened. His fingers were already going numb, but he shoved his free hand into his pocket, pulling out the gold ticket. It was ice cold, as if it had absorbed the very essence of the storm. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, and then jammed the ticket into the slot near the lever. It fit perfectly. The sound was deafening. A metallic click, then a grinding, roaring howl as if the train itself was screaming. The very walls trembled, the windows cracking, the lights flickering violently. The air ripped open, the storm outside collapsing in on itself. Jack yanked the lever. A thunderous crack split the air. The cascade bell lurched, metal groaning in protest. Jack staggered back, gripping the control panel as an unseen force rushed through the train. Then, silence. One by one, the passengers blinked into existence. They appeared from nowhere, stumbling into the aisles, eyes wide, their expressions fogged with confusion. It was like watching people wake from a dream they didn't know they were having. Henry Slater stumbled out of the lounge car, his face pale. "Jack," his voice was hoarse, disbelieving. Jack met his gaze, his breath steady now. "We're going home." The cascade bell shuddered forward, the last traces of the storm vanishing into the ether. Dawn. The train pulled into Denver Station beneath a sky painted in hues of gold and rose, the mountains glowing in the distance. The wooden platform creaked under Jack's boots as he stepped off, the familiar weight of reality settling onto his shoulders. Around him, the passengers stretched and yawned, rubbing their eyes as though they had simply slept through the entire journey. Their faces were blank, their memories wiped. Jack's chest tightened. It was as if none of it had ever happened. Slater stopped beside him, squinting at the rising sun. "You remember any of that?" Jack glanced at him. Every second. Slater swallowed, his expression grim. He didn't need to say anything else. Jack reached into his pocket, fingers closing around something cold, the gold ticket. He pulled it out, watching as it shimmered faintly in the morning light. The date was gone, erased. The ink that once marked time itself had vanished, leaving behind only his name, Jack Callahan. "You think it's over?" Slater asked. Jack exhaled slowly, watching as the cascade bell rolled away, its wheels clicking softly against the tracks, disappearing into the horizon. He wanted to believe it, but deep down, he wasn't so sure. Jack closed his eyes, but the train never truly left him. The scent of polished wood and candle-lit dinners lingered, the muffled laughter of unseen passengers floating in the air. A cold draft whispered against his neck. Was it real, or just memory clawing at his thoughts? He shook his head, forcing himself back to reality. The newspaper lay open before him, its brittle pages crumbling at the edges, an artifact of time long past. His fingers traced the faded ink of an 1894 headline, tucked away in the archives like a secret no one wanted to remember. "Black Summit Wreck, Freight Train Found Abandoned, No Survivors, No Crew." Jack's breath hitched. The article claimed the train had derailed, but there were no bodies. The tracks remained intact, untouched, as if the cascade bell itself had simply appeared. His pulse quickened. Had it happened before? Was the cascade bell just one of many? And if so, how many others had vanished? How many more were still out there, trapped between the pages of forgotten history? The golden ticket sat beside the newspaper, glistening softly under the dim apartment light. It felt colder than before, heavy. Jack knew it wasn't over. That afternoon, he returned to his apartment, his mind tangled in questions with no answers. Slipping his key into the lock, he froze. A small slip of paper lay beneath the door, a telegram. Jack unfolded it with steady hands. "Jack, I saw him, the conductor. He was standing at the station last night, watching. I don't think it's over. Henry Slater." The words burned into his mind. Jack exhaled slowly, folding the telegram before slipping it into his coat. He needed distance. The next train out of Denver was bound for Chicago at noon. He'd take it. Clear his head, try to escape. But deep down he already knew there was no escape. The station was quiet as he boarded. The conductor, a normal one this time, greeted him with a polite nod, barely looking up as Jack handed over his regular ticket. The golden stub remained hidden in his pocket, pulsing against his fingers. The train lurched forward, steel grinding against steel as it pulled away from the platform, Denver shrinking behind him. Jack leaned against the window, watching the snow-covered plains stretch endlessly under the dimming sky. Then he saw it, his breath hitched, his fingers tightening around the gold ticket stub. Just beyond the trees, running parallel to his train, another set of tracks emerged from the snow. A shadow glided silently through the frost-covered landscape, spectral and untouched by time. The Cascade Bell. Jack's stomach twisted. Its windows glowed faintly, golden light flickering against the swirling snow. Shadowy figures filled the dining car passengers who shouldn't exist. And near the engine, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, was him, the conductor. His face was pale as death, eyes hollow, fixed straight ahead, not looking at Jack, but waiting. Jack's breath came shallow, his own train rumbled forward, yet the Cascade Bell never fell behind. It matched his speed exactly, as if reality itself had bent to keep them side by side. And then it vanished. Like mist dissolving into the wind, it melted into the trees, fading into the darkness beyond the snow. Gone. Jack leaned back in his seat, fingers trembling, his grip tightening around the ticket. Somewhere out there, the Cascade Bell was still running. He knew it, and deep down he knew the tracks would lead him back to it, sooner or later.